Thanks so much to the International Literacy Association, a special interest group in adolescent literacy, for naming me a thought leader in adolescent literacy. I'm very grateful and very humbled, and thank you so much for this honor. I also want to apologize for not being there with you at your conference in St. Louis, but I'm doing national writing project work with countless teachers from across Idaho, so I know you understand. I've been asked to give a very brief review of some of my most recent work, so I'm going to do that right now. My most recent study is called Reading Unbound, and it's really about the power of pleasure and how it motivates reading. We did look at freely chosen texts that kids choose to read, and we also paid special attention to freely chosen reading of marginalized texts, so vampire novels, dystopia, things that often make parents and teachers nervous. And we looked at how this promoted pleasure, imagination, satisfaction, psychological growth, and social action. The book that we report all this research out in is called Reading Unbound: Why Kids Need to Read What They Want and Why We Should Let Them, where you'll get a full review of the literature and of the methodology and our major findings. Today, I want to talk a little bit about the impetus of the study and what our major findings were. Personally, as a teacher of now 33 years, I've always worried about promoting substantive engagement, pleasure, and even joy in school, which I think sometimes is sadly lacking and is kind of a tragedy of education. I've also worried about promoting critical literacy, identity formation, and imagination, which of course are the primary tasks of adolescence. And I've worried about doing this in the never-ending soul tsunami of standards and assessments and all that stuff we have to do. Now, there were two major sets of findings in our study. The first is that kids read what they find pleasurable, but we also found that there were multiple dimensions of pleasure, that pleasure went way beyond how we normally conceive of it. And also that kids tend to read what they need. If they choose to read vampire novels or romances or dystopia books, it's because they have a human developmental need at this point in their life to read those kind of books, that it's assisting them through that developmental journey. And we call that inner work. We also, because we want our research to matter, we paid a lot of attention to how can we leverage these findings in our teaching and our parenting. Now, as a short synopsis, our data show that when students are free reading for pleasure, even of these marginalized texts, then in fact they are motivated and have a continuing impulse to read and learn, that they want to continue reading those books and they want to talk about those books. And they're progressing towards all the goals I've had for my students as readers, as learners, and people throughout my teaching career. So in fact, when kids are free reading the books they choose to read, they're meeting all the goals I've always had and that school has always had. And they're meeting all the goals of next generation standards and preparing themselves for next generation assessments. So we found there's no reason, and in fact there are no reasons not to do free reading and many reasons to do it given the current constraints we're working on. I did want to give a short shout out to the power of pleasure in the British cohort study. You may know the British love doing these longitudinal studies like 7 up, 14 up, all the way to 56 up. They love to follow, tons and tons, thousands of people throughout a lifetime. And the British cohort study is one such study where they followed the lives of more than 17,000 people born in England, Scotland, and Wales in a single week of 1970. The latest analysis mirrors our own findings, but it's longitudinal, so it adds some robustness to our findings. And their analysis established that reading for pleasure in youth, outside of school, has a highly significant impact on people's later educational attainment and social mobility, in part because pleasure reading actually, quote, increased cognitive progress over time. Now, pleasure reading in youth was much more explanatory and much more significant than parents' education or socioeconomic status when it came to social mobility and future educational attainment. That's mind-blowing, because if you know the data, you know that almost all of it shows the primary explanatory factor of kids' social mobility and later attainment is the parents' socioeconomic status and education. This analysis found that pleasure reading was even more explanatory. That's mind-blowing. Now, we found that pleasure has multiple dimensions. The first dimension which is what we usually think of when we think of pleasure, is what we call play pleasure, or immersive play pleasure. Paul, in our study, said this: I read because I love it, I just get this joy reading, it doesn't have any restrictions to it. Kylie, I absolutely believe that the characters are real. Jazzy, I read it because I like it. I like living through the stories. Now, it was very interesting in the study when we asked kids, why did you love that book? They would immediately talk about immersive play pleasure. They would say, I just like it. Jazzy's my daughter. She would often say, Dad, don't ruin it for me. I just love Harry Potter. But as researchers, of course, you're always pushing and you're trying to get the underside of the story. And I said, for instance, to Jasmine, who is your favorite Harry Potter character? And she said, Hermione, duh. And I said, why is Hermione your favorite character? And she said, because she's the best friend ever, duh. And she was actually wearing, along with her friends, these WWHD bracelets. What would Hermione do? And she said, whenever I'm having trouble with a friend, I look at that and say, what would Hermione do? Because she's the best friend ever. Notice her pleasure was going way beyond the immersive play pleasure of living through the story. She had pleasure in relating socially to Hermione. She had pleasure in rehearsing what we called work pleasure for her life and inner work pleasure for who she wanted to become. So even though the kids initially said this was the kind of pleasure that they were embracing, in fact, quickly we found that they were embracing other kinds of pleasure. Play pleasure, following John Dewey, is that which puts itself forth with no thought of anything beyond. We found that everybody in our study so fully entered the world of the stories they read that the characters were real to them. Rebecca said the characters become like your friends and you're so much in their lives that they're like your best friends. So you're living through the story, you're participating in the story, you're enjoying the story. And this was prerequisite to all the other kinds of pleasure, which we think is very, very important. If kids don't immerse and live through the story and visualize that story and participate in the story, then the other kinds of pleasure did not accrue. How can you foster the pleasure of play? Well, drama, revolving role play, in-role writing, hot seating with a good or bad angel, all of these things that help kids become characters and relate to characters in the way the committed readers in our study do would help with that kind of immersive play pleasure, which again is prerequisite to the other kinds of pleasure. A second pleasure was work pleasure. This is using reading as a tool to get something functional done right now in your life or in the world. And the kids really wanted to do things immediately, have an immediate functional value for what they read. Drake had this to say: when you are done reading, you ought to be able to fix or do something. Jazzy, I read because I want to be able to talk about stuff, to be more powerful, to be able to help people, to get important stuff done. She was a dystopia reader, and she wanted to explore what she read in argument, in talk, and in action. Now, how do you foster work pleasure? Frame text and units as inquiry, as a problem to be solved by using essential questions. Work towards culminating projects, service and social action. Do drama work, where you're rehearsing, how do I want to be in the world, what can I do with the experiences I've learned about. Now, inner work pleasure was a very interesting find to us, and this is about becoming the kind of people that they wanted to become. Inner work, according to the Jungian scholar Robert Johnson, is the effort by which we gain an awareness of the deeper layers of consciousness within us and move to an actualization and integration of the total self. So it's becoming more of who you're meant to be, a fuller, more powerful human being. And this was the most intense and moving pleasure on the part of our participants. Here's how. Characters are ways of thinking, really. They are ways of being you can try on. You can sort of help yourself change in that way. And when you really admire a character in a book who's really brave and stuff, you can kind of idolize them and become more like them. So it's not really learning about yourself, it's learning about what you could be, which is why Jasmine and her friends talked about WWHD. What kind of friend do I want to be? How can my reading help me become that? It reminds me of the relationships with authors as inner work. Simone de Beauvoir wrote, I became a writer because I wanted to be loved like I loved George Eliot as a girl. She wanted to become the kind of person that was worthy of that. Harold Bronte writes, reading is the most intimate act between people because it is the most sustained intimacy between minds. When we read, we get to know an author and their way of thinking and being. Intellectual pleasure was a fourth pleasure. This was figuring things out as an intellectual puzzle. Alex, reading is like being a detective almost. It's taking the evidence and the information and everything that's happened taking all that and putting it together, processing through it and seeing what ins connect, and then finding, once all those ins connect, what that last piece is. This is the pleasure that I think schools most nearly approach, although, as Canley explained, schools often interfere with it as well. In out-of-school reading, you don't have the preconceived notion of school. You have, this looks like an interesting book, let's see what it's about. And that just broadens the horizon, because without the preconceived notion of what you should be learning, then you don't have the set limits and set expectations for yourself or for the book. So you can engage in any intellectual puzzle, figuring out how that text works for meaning and effect, or how it conveys intellectual puzzles to you that you can apply to the world. So how do we foster intellectual pleasure? We could read a book for the first time along with our students, figuring it out along with them, modeling our fits and starts. One of the problems we've seen in schools is that kids never think they're going to read like their teacher, but their teacher's reading a book they already know and have read many, many times. So why not read it with them and show them how you're figuring stuff out and how things might go wrong for you and how you fix it. Parent-assigned reading was the self-selected reading. This last year we read 1984. The kids said, can we read The Hunger Games along with it? I read The Hunger Games for the first time with them, and we could see how those two books were similar, how they were both in the dystopic genre. Frame readings and units as inquiry with essential questions as a problem to be solved, which fosters work and intellectual pleasures. Teach kids how to generate questions for discussion and sharing using techniques like question the author or question-answer relationships. Use discussion structures like Socratic seminar that make it clear there is no teacherly agenda to fulfill as far as topics or insights to achieve. And this is very consistent with the next generation standards, which focus on strategies over content. Final pleasure is social pleasure. And this had a lot of dimensions. The kids took great joy in relating to authors, relating to characters, relating to other readers, affiliating with groups of readers or interest groups, and with staking one's identity. This is jazzy. I'm part of a cultural club that grew up with Harry Potter. It gave me a sense of belonging. I loved wondering what I thought was going to happen, talking to my friends about that, aligning myself with characters, waiting so impatiently for the next book. No other group of kids will have that experience again. It kind of marks you as when you grew up and bonds you with other people your age. Now notice what she's saying here. It's very interesting and nuanced. One of the few ways I was cool as a dad when Jasmine was growing up is that I'm a scholastic author, and so we would get the Harry Potter books FedExed to us the day they came out. So I was very cool for at least that day. Now Jasmine is saying, you will never read Harry Potter like me, because I was his age when every book came out. So she's affiliating with other Harry Potter readers, but also identifying as somebody who grew up with Harry Potter. So you will never be able to read Harry Potter like you. So she's doing a lot of identity work and a lot of affiliating here. Here's Benny. I like to think of myself as a Harry Potter reader, as someone who has imagination and is a good friend, who admires characters and people like Hermione for her friendship and Harry for his courage, who reads books that help you with the challenges you are facing. So notice she's marking her identity as a Harry Potter reader, and that has a lot of other identifying features. This resonates with the research of Erik Erikson that staking our identity as the primary task of early to late adolescence. That our job as adolescents is to resolve role confusion, and we achieve that through our evolving interest and competence. Fostering social pleasure. Be a fellow reader with your kids. Read one of their favorite books. I'll read one of yours if you read one of mine. Foster peer discussion of reading and response in pairs, try it in small groups, literature circles. Do group projects with reading that are then shared, like videos, public service announcements, dramas, visual displays, talk shows. Have family and friends nights where kids share their reading and the projects they've done around their reading. And have a free reading program. Promote books through book talks, online reviews, etc. Go to the bookstore. Give books as gifts. Other takeaways from our study? To cultivate engaged and lifelong readers, we have become convinced that we must make the cultivation of all these pleasures central to our teaching. If you want kids to become lifelong readers, if you want them to become engaged civic agents, you need to cultivate all of these pleasures. And remember that immersive play pleasure is prerequisite to and supports all the other pleasures. So if kids do not enjoy what they're reading, if they don't live through the story, relate to the characters, they're not going to get these other pleasures. So we really have to promote that. I've also been asked to briefly mention what I'm working on now. So to conclude, I'm working on a book called Reader's Rules of Notice for Nonfiction. I'm doing it with Michael Smith, who also was my co-author and co-researcher on the Reading Unbound, the Power of Pleasure Reading study. We're using Kenneth Burke's parlor metaphor that literature is part of an ongoing conversation. So we're asking the kids to figure out what do we have to notice the conversational topics in the books that we read. And we're also using Peter Rabinowitz's idea of rules of notice. How do texts cue us to notice what's most important and what we need to remember and carry forward through a text? And how do we notice how this is structured for meaning and effect? We've been having great fun working with the teachers who we work with around these rules of notice. And it's going to be a fun book to read, and I hope you'll buy a copy when it comes out in November. And remember, I still have girls in college, so also buy your copy of Reading Unbound, Why Kids Need to Read What They Want and Why We Should Let Them. I can't think of anything more important that leverages our goals more easily than foregrounding the power of pleasure and hard fun in our reading and in our schools. Thanks so much again for the award. Thank you so much for all the great work you do for your students and for other teachers. And as I say to my own students, go forth and spread sweetness and light. Enjoy the rest of your conference. Thank you so much.